Welcome, class. This is the first lecture, and I always like to start this lecture in the beginning of my markets and resource allocation class and in my macroeconomics class. So the first question is, what is economics? Well, basically, economics is the study of the economy, but that brings us to a second question. Well, what is the economy? The economy is how societies organize themselves to take care of their material well-being. Now, we have noticed throughout human history that societies have found different ways to organize themselves in order to take care of their material provisioning. And at the very least, this method of organization has to provide resources for food in order to meet the biological and nutritional requirements, and then they also need to provide resources for shelter in order to protect against natural disasters. So there's three types of resources that societies have used in order to take care of the material well-being, and we refer to these as land, labor, and capital. Or for land, we can think of it in terms of natural resources. And it's not as simple as natural resources because there's two types of natural resources. There's exhaustible natural resources, and then there's renewable natural resources. So exhaustible natural resources are fossil fuels such as coal, oil, etc. And then our renewable resources are solar, wind, and things like that. But we just can't use natural resources alone. We have to combine natural resources with our labor. But it's not just physical labor. We like to talk of labor in terms of human capital. So it's a combination of mental and physical exertion. And then in order to provide societies with what they need to protect against, at very minimum, the vulgarities of nature, but also to provide food for themselves. You just can't have land and labor. You actually need to combine that with some sort of equipment, physical capital goods. And we call these reproducible inputs or produced means of production. So, for example, we just can't grow a tomato with labor alone. We need land, first of all, and if we want to grow tomatoes, we need to have an actual field, and then we need to have labor, and then we need to have some sort of capital piece of equipment like a shovel. So a laborer takes a shovel, digs a hole, and plants tomato seeds, and eventually you get a tomato. So in order to grow tomatoes, you need a combination of natural resources, human resources, and capital goods. And so natural resources we just talked about, they are in two groups, exhaustible resources and renewable resources. And this is comes into controversy today because with the threat of climate change and also with the sheer fact that these at least exhaustible resources will run out, we need to decide how best to utilize these natural resources. And we teach a whole class on this. It's called environmental economics, and it is quite interesting. We'll just kind of touch on it here in this class. And then human resources, we talked about that's a combination of mental and physical exertion. You just can't have physical work. You need it to be combined with mental work as well. So we actually talk about labor in terms of either human resources or some people call it human capital. So human capital needs to combine with natural resources to produce stuff. But like we said, we just can't combine human capital with natural resources to produce stuff. We also need to have human capital and natural resources combined with some sort of machine, right? So whether we're growing tomatoes, then we need a shovel in order to grow the tomatoes. Or if I'm giving a lecture. I'm currently lecturing in front of a computer. So this computer is my machine, which is being combined with, labor in order to produce a economics lecture or anything of this sort, right? So in order to produce goods and services, we always need a combination of natural resources, human resources or human capital, and physical capital goods. Now this capital, it's a certain type. There's what we're talking about here in economics is we're talking about physical capital goods used for the production of commodities. Okay, that's what we mean by a capital input. It is a machine that's used for the production of commodities. But then what is a commodity? A commodity is anything that is for sale on the market. Okay, so for a good to be a capital good, it must be used for the production of anything for sale on the market. And we call these reproducible inputs because they are constantly being used as an input into the production of output, or commodities. Now, in terms of production, we figured out, okay, how is society going to produce something? It's going to be it's going to be some combination of human capital, land, and physical capital goods for the production of commodities, which is anything for sale on the market. Well, okay, now we answered our how question. We'll combine those three inputs somehow to produce an output. And there's different ways to combine these three inputs, but we'll get to that in a second. But that's our how question. But that doesn't solve any problems. We need to also decide in our society, well, what are we going to be producing? Okay? We just can't be producing whatever. We need to at least produce things that are going to provide us food and shelter, and we're going to have to figure that out. Now, like I just talked about last time, or last slide, often there's different methods to produce this similar kinds of goods. So we just can't figure out what to produce. We also have to figure out how we're going to be combining our inputs, land, labor, and capital, to produce our output. And there's going to be different ways to do it. Now, if society decides what to produce and how to produce it and does so effectively, the question is, will that allow for the viability of our society? The answer is no. We must also decide, well, how are we going to distribute that output that we end up producing? So the economic problem then is a question of production and distribution. The economic problem answers the question of what to produce, how to produce it, and how to distribute it. Those three questions: what to produce, how to produce it, and how to distribute it. It is a question of production and distribution. So how then have societies answered this question, or have tried to solve the problem, the economic problem of production and distribution? Well, throughout most of human history, society has decided to organize itself into what we may call traditional societies. Now, in traditional societies, over long periods of time, through processes of trial and error, social institutions evolved to answer the questions that determined production and distribution. Or in other words, they formed traditional ways to figure out what to produce, how to produce it, how we combine our land, labor, and capital in order to produce output, and then finally, after we produce that output, how are we going to distribute that output throughout society? Now, the traditional societies that developed formed social rules and codes of behavior that determined who does what. So basically, it created a division of labor. And who gets what, which created the division or the distribution of the output of society. So in traditional societies, the question of the division of labor and the distribution of the output is some combination of age, gender, and kinship relationships. So age, gender, and kinship. Young men herd large animals, women tend gardens and build the home, children take care of small animals and fetch firewood and water, elders make management decisions and settle disputes, and then the senior elders are keepers of history and ritual. Now, this is just a generic example of how societies would organize themselves. However, throughout most of human history, and actually it's even seen in present time, traditional societies was the most sustainable method for society's organization. You didn't need these formal institutions that we have today, these formal governing structures that we have, but you did have many informal governing structures which, basically decided the division of laborers, and then it basically decided the distribution of the output, and it was based upon basically family size or maybe your social class or things like that. But just to let you guys know that even though we don't live in a traditional society today, traditional societies have been around for most of human history. So a very important part of traditional societies is this notion of reciprocity. Reciprocity is mutual gift giving. So from early on in life, members or families of traditional societies began giving gifts to their neighbors, or kinfolk, and other people. And basically, when you give a gift to another member of your family or another member of a neighboring village, for example, that gift imposes a reciprocal transaction. So later on, the person who you gave a gift to will return that to you an additional gift. So the way this basically works is it helps prevent against localized shocks. So for example, let's say there's two villages, one on each side of the mountain. And then during very good years, when there's a large surplus of the agriculture and things like that, one village has more than they could possibly need. So they give what is left over to the neighbors on the other side of the mountain. So village 2 now has all this extra food and that they got from village 1, and they eat it and they continue to survive. But now, since village 1 gave food to village 2, village 2 must now give food back to village 1. So now when village 2 has a large surplus because they have a very good harvest, for example, then they give part of their surplus back to village 1. And this allows then, if there's a drought in village 1 but not in village 2, then the shortage from village 1 will be supplemented by the surplus from village 2, for example. So the thing about this reciprocal or reciprocity is that it, again, prevents against localized shocks. If you have a drought in one of the two villages, well, then that drought will be subsidized by a surplus from the other village. And this is kind of a very early form of what we would think of as international trade, right? So in contemporary societies, international trade helps prevent against localized shocks to any specific region. So, for example, if there is a natural disaster in China or Japan, China or Japan can count on the U.S. to provide, medical supplies, food, etc., things like that. So, as I was saying, this notion of reciprocity, reciprocal gift giving, protects against localized drought, any sort of epidemics in agriculture, crop failure, or any other localized shocks. Also against natural disasters such as flooding or earthquakes or anything like that. So, giving is an economic necessity, and they don't have to, or in traditional societies, they don't have to labor or pasture to take care of more livestock. And we especially have to remember that in traditional societies, there's not an adequate refrigeration supply. So if they didn't, in terms of livestock, their meat, if they don't give away their surplus, well, it would just spoil. So that is the historical account of it. And we just okay, similar to reciprocity, but in this case, we're talking about traditional institutions which redistribute the economic surplus or the agricultural surplus throughout the community. And this normally takes place during the time of a harvest festival. So during the harvest festival, the community gathers together, they celebrate, they eat, sing, dance, and they continue to pledge and follow the rules of the community. Now, during the community festival, what they do is they end up consuming the agricultural surplus for the year, or at least part of the agricultural surplus that was not given to other villages or tribes. But now this begs the question, well, what should societies do with their economic surplus? Should they give it away in form of reciprocal gift giving? Should they have a community festival to reinforce the rules and customs of the community? What should they do with their surplus? So, as way of an example, let's just say that we start out with 10,000 bushels of corn of output. Now, to make those 10,000 bushels of corn, let's say that we need 1,000 bushels of corn as seed, and then we need 8,000 bushels of corn as food for the laborers and other members of the community. So we end up using 9,000 bushels of corn in order for society to reproduce itself. Now, basically, we kind of call this the corn model. We have 10,000 bushels of corn output, but to get that output, we had 8,000 bushels of corn food. It's food for the laborers, so that's basically our labor input. 1,000 bushels of corn seed, that can be thought of as a capital good. And then 8,000 bushels of food, which is equivalent to the amount of labor, plus 1,000 bushels of capital, yield 9,000 bushels of inputs to produce 10,000 bushels of output. So therefore, we have 1,000 bushels left over. We only need 9,000 bushels for as our food and in order to feed the population. So we have this 1,000 left over, and that 1,000 can be we can do a lot of things with it. We can give it all away to a neighboring village in terms of reciprocity, for example, or we can use the entire 1,000 bushels for a harvest feast, or we can give it to anyone who's not directly involved in producing corn, like the elders or whomever. But now, let's suppose one year that the elders got together and say, hey, instead of using 1,000 bushels as corn seed, let's increase that by 100 bushels and use 1,100 bushels of corn seed and only have 900 bushels for the surplus, which we can use to, do these various things, distribute to other villages or whatever. But point is that we're only going to use $900 for or 900 bushels for a surplus. rather than 1,000 bushels for a surplus. And now we're going to have 1,100 bushels as inputs rather than 1,000. Well, if 1,000 bushels of inputs got us 10,000 output of corn, then 1,100 bushels of inputs will give us 11,000 bushels of corn output. So more inputs, more corn used as seed, yields more output, and then more output yields more surplus because the size of population hasn't changed. So as we see, we have 1,100 units of corn as our capital inputs, plus 8,000 units of corn needed to feed our laborers. So we have 9,100 units of corn, our total inputs. And that 9,100 units of corn produces, for inputs, produces 11,000 units of corn as output. So if we subtract off our output, 11,000 units of corn, minus our input, 9,100 units of corn, we end up with 1,900 units of corn as our surplus. So before we only had 1,000 units as our surplus. Now we have 1,900 as a surplus. So now we have a much larger surplus. What can we do with that? We can have a larger feast. We can add more of that into the corn seed. We can redistribute it among the community so everybody gets more food. We can trade it with friends, etc., etc. So what is happening here? Well, we see what's happening in modern terms is that we're using this surplus to increase the size of the inputs. In economics, we call this investment. So again, when we talk about investment in economics, we're not talking about investment in financial assets. We're talking about investment in capital goods, or the purchase of or use of physical inputs to create more output. And the larger output is called economic growth, and the surplus is what we would call profits. So, following the surplus, what can happen as a result of this process? More output can support a growing population, larger labor force. More people can lead to territorial expansion, meet new peoples, intermarry, marshal alliances, trade new products, invest in new technologies, which creates more output and more surplus, and so on and so forth. All this leads to growth and expansion. However, growth and expansion leads to a situation where the old rules of traditional societies do not always satisfy the needs of the community, and is not even capable of satisfying the needs of the community because the community is just getting too large. Traditional societies work best when communities are smaller, but as society grows and you get more output, these traditional rules do not work as well. So along human history, we see that society advanced from what we would term as traditional societies to a command system. Now, in command societies, you have a different method of organization. So, what we saw in traditional societies was that religious or cultural institutions determined who gets what, who does what, and how to distribute the output. Now, in a command society, political institutions determine production distributions, and it's usually through some central planning authority, a chief, lord, king, central planning board, whatever, decides who gets what and who does what. So an example of command societies would be like European feudalism, not China, for example. China is not a command society in the way we're thinking of it. China resembles more of a market-based society. When we talk about a command society here, we're really talking about where you have a definite hierarchy of decision-making, of production distribution. So I like to think of it in terms of European feudalism. So you have the king on the very top making the production, ultimately making production distribution decisions. Then you have the non-working class of priests and lords, or etc. Then on the bottom you have the serfs. Another type of command society is slavery. You had enslavement of Africans to perform plantation labor in the New World. That might be a form of what we'd call capitalistic slavery, but throughout human society, you had the enslavement of many peoples in order to marshal resources. The pyramids were built by slaves, enslaved Egyptians, etc. So the nice thing about command is it's a very effective way of marshaling resources. You just tell people that, oh, you must produce this or you must produce that. So many of the great public works of the ancient world were a result of a command type system. This is a picture of the Great Wall, which was built in a command type system. Again, the pyramids were the same way. Some of the great Roman temples are the same way. The castles in the UK, things like that. Obviously, command is also very brutal when you have the enslavement of entire ethnicities. Now, the third type of societal organization, which is going to be important for our class, is production distribution through the market mechanism. Now, in tradition, you had production distribution determined by some combination of age, gender, and kinship relationships based upon cultural norms and institutions. In command, you had political institutions determining production distribution. In the market, it appears to be just millions and billions of independent decision makers concerning purchasing of products and selling of products. But if the market were only millions and billions of independent decisions concerning buying and selling, it wouldn't have lasted very long. So it must be more than that. It must be a systematic way of determining production distribution. Now, markets are prone to booms and busts, crises, recessions, depressions are all part of markets, but there's still something orderly about the market mechanism, even with all of its faults. Now, economics came into being, or what was earlier called political economy, came into being in order to discover or uncover the rules that govern the market's systematic operation. So, like we said, in traditional societies, the economy was embedded in cultural institutions. So there was no reason for that to be a separate study outside of the study of cultural institutions. In command societies, the economy was embedded in political institutions. So there was no necessity to study economics outside of politics. Now, in market societies, for the first time, a distinctly economic institution governed production and distribution. So the economy became disembedded, if you will, from the cultural or political institutions that it was once a part of. So, what are the institutions then that govern a market's systematic operation? Well, one of the main institutions is this institution of competition or supply and demand forces, which allows the price mechanism through bargaining or haggling. That said, there is no pure type of economic system, traditional command market, except in some traditional societies where there's virtually no command or market. But most historical societies is some combination of tradition, command, and market. Command systems and the edges still had tradition at the local level, traditional societies had some form of command elements, and market societies have some form of all three. So, normally we don't like to talk about our contemporary society in terms of a market economy, but we like to think of a mixed system. Whether we label it traditional command of market depends upon the dominant way production distribution is organized. So, command in contemporary society. Even in the United States, for example, or Canada, where we would think of the economy to really be market-based, we still have healthy amounts of command. Governments make decisions to build schools, bridges, hospitals, the military. All of this production is determined by command. Taxation is a form of command. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Obamacare, which is the new healthcare initiative, all of these are forms of taxation and redistribution. Any form of welfare is a form of taxation and redistribution. This is all based upon command. It is our central government governing the production and distribution of these resources. Tradition in a modern market society. Examples of this include tipping, holiday gift giving, bonuses, volunteer work, cooperative ventures like the food co-op here in town, any type of volunteerism. All of this is basically tradition. Some people would argue, actually most people would argue, that markets would not exist without healthy amounts of both tradition and command. Both necessitate for a market to happen. So, political economy and economics. It was to discover or uncover the rules that govern the market's systematic operation that economics was first came into being. Now, there's not just one theory of how markets operate. There's actually contending perspectives. That said, in economics, we're going to use a lot of modeling in this class. So economists just use models. Models make unrealistic assumptions, but that can be okay if done properly. So the point of a model is to identify the key features and to highlight the relationships between variables. We don't need to describe everything. We just need to describe what's necessary in order to answer the question being asked. Findings are preliminary, and we can add some of the noise, some of the things that we abstract from back in. So an example I always like to give is think of the velocity of falling objects. We always say that objects fall at a constant rate. Objects fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. Okay, that's the law of gravity. However, as we know, that's not always true, right? If we drop a sheet of paper and a brick from the top of a building, well, the brick's going to fall first. Why? Well, because we take out all the noise, right? We take out all the abstract from the surface area of the piece of paper, or if we drop it from the top of the building, there might be a wind blowing. We take away, the factor of wind and all this stuff, and we figure out the law of gravity as if objects were falling in a vacuum. But objects never fall in a vacuum, but we need to make that assumption first, because we have to say, okay, in a perfect world, what is the rate at which two objects fall? Leaving everything else constant. And then, once we figure that out, then we can bring things back in. Well, what if we drop a piece of paper and a brick? What's the surface area of the piece of paper? How is that going to affect it, the rate at which it falls? What if there's a 35 mile per hour southeasterly wind blowing? How is that going to affect the rate at which the paper is going to fall? We can figure that out because we first figured out, well, what's the rate that a piece of paper falls in a vacuum, right? Leaving everything else constant. This leaving everything else constant assumption is called ceteris paribus, or all things remaining the same. We make the same assumption in economics, and the questions that we need to basically ask is, are the assumptions that we make in economics, are they reasonable? Because unlike the physical sciences, the social sciences is more fuzzy, right? We always need to ask, well, are these assumptions reasonable or not? So, we need to concern ourselves with the fallacy of composition. This is going to come up in both micro and macroeconomics, but it's going to be very important in, especially in macroeconomics. So the fallacy of composition and what is good for the individual is not necessarily good for society as a whole. So in microeconomics, what is good for the individual firm, for example, it's really good for Apple to make profits. Or it's really good for ExxonMobil to make profits. But is it good for society as a whole for ExxonMobil to make profits or for Apple to make profits? Maybe not, right? Maybe because if ExxonMobil makes profits, they don't obey enough safety regulations and communities get harmed, for example. In macroeconomics, this comes up with our analysis of savings. Is it good for an individual to save? Absolutely. Is it good for everybody to save? No, because when people are saving their money, they're not spending their money at Starbucks. And if they're not spending their money at Starbucks, then Starbucks is not hiring workers. And if Starbucks is not hiring workers, then people aren't getting paid wages, and then those workers aren't getting income, and because they're not getting income, they're not going to Target, and so on and so forth. So we have to kind of separate out what's good for the individual, consumer or firm, might not be good for society as a whole. And we're going to be addressing those in both microeconomics and macroeconomics. Now, there's different schools of thought, and we can contrast it between neoclassical micro and macroeconomics, and that's the theory that markets basically work. And we don't need government to intervene in the market mechanism. We'll talk about why that's sort of a fallacy in both microeconomics and macroeconomics. And then the second school of thought is called basically broadly Keynesian, after this economist John Maynard Keynes. So normally we would think of those as two schools of macroeconomic thought, but it's really two schools of microeconomic thought as well, and we'll talk about that. So the neoclassical school began with the classical economists of David Ricardo and Adam Smith. This was called the surplus approach. In fact, that corn model that I just talked about actually came out of David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy. He was the first one to come up with it. Adam Smith came up with the division of labor, and these are kind of the classical schools of thought. Now, the neoclassical or the neoclassical schools of thought came from the Gang of Four: Alfred Marshall, Jevons, Menger, and Walras. And these four economists, they are basically credited with coming up with neoclassical microeconomics. But those microeconomics, especially the principles of supply and demand, and other things that we'll talk about, utility and utility maximization, we'll talk about those as the course goes on. They're credited with coming up with the basic tenets used in neoclassical microeconomics, which are then applied in neoclassical macroeconomics. This idea of marginalism and things like that, you don't have to really worry about these terms right now, but we will talk about them later on in the course. So the main principle of neoclassical micro and macroeconomics is that you have resource scarcity. Now, when we talk about resource scarcity, we're not talking about absolute scarcity. However, we could with like exhaustible resources. There is absolute scarcity of oil and coal, for example. It's going to run out. But normally we would think of it in terms of relative scarcity or scarcity relative to our unlimited human desires. And what we're going to talk about in the next topic is this notion of opportunity cost. And opportunity cost is the value of what could have been produced if resources were used in the best alternative way. That will come up in chapter 2. And then what will also come up in chapter 2 is this notion of production possibilities. Production possibilities, we're going to use a economic model, and we're going to assume that we only have two goods, guns and butter. And we're going to assume that our inputs, our land, labor, and capital, are constant. And then we're going to ask the question, how can we efficiently allocate within a market system land, labor, and capital in order to maximize consumer satisfaction? And that's where we're going to next.